Okay, let's take a look at the third section here, which is the language of responsibility. So, what we're looking at in this one is understanding and then thinking about how you can use language that reflects responsibility for thoughts and actions. And there are three sections in here. I think the second one is the easiest to understand, but let's look at this first of all. Choosing the right language and using language of responsibility can really shape the tone or the communication climate, which we will talk about. The very last chapter is about climate. Okay. Sometimes what people want to do is they make an it statement rather than saying I. They 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 use it to remove themselves a little bit from the situation, and they deflect responsibility. So they would say something like, it's a bad idea, instead of saying, I don't think it's a good idea. Okay, now obviously there's it's in that one too, but when you take I out of there, you're removing yourself from the situation. Okay, and it comes across it's a little passive aggressive. I gotta say, I think my favorite are but statements because a but statement cancels the thought that precedes it. And you all know if somebody says, I really like you, but whatever follows is not going to be good. Because once we hear the but, we instantly forget what came before it. I have worked hard, don't always succeed, on removing this word from my comments, both oral and in written form. And you can't substitute however. Okay, it's so. Uh, I like the example they give. The paper has some good ideas, but I'm giving it a grade of D because it's late. Okay. Actually, my sister told me about this years ago. The paper has some really good ideas. Because it's late, you earn a D. So basically what you're doing is you're separating it into two separate statements. Now, I might say something like, you've got some really great ideas in the second paragraph. I'd like you to make sure that the third paragraph is equally as strong. I could have said, you've got some great ideas in the second paragraph, but the third paragraph is weak. Unfortunately, with the but statements, we stop listening, in a sense. So I think you get that. This is relatively simple to understand. The language of responsibility, continuing with I, you, and we language statements or language. Okay, the problem when we use you language, it's really the equivalent of pointing a finger at somebody. It's expressing judgment, and it makes the other person feel defensive. I think I've already told the class that my husband has a tendency to, even though we have shoes by the door, he doesn't always take them off there. But wherever he takes his shoes off tends to be where they are. And so I might say something like, you left your shoes all over the place. Actually, I'm more likely to say, you make me crazy, which we'll talk about chapter 9 when we talk about emotions. Okay, so as soon as, and most of the time when we say you, our tone gets a little like we're scolding somebody. So instead of using you language, you can use I language. It's more assertive, it's probably more accurate, and it's definitely less provocative. I don't like it when you leave your shoes in front of the couch, for example. What I like here is the book on page 167 gives some great example sentences. And they say, if you want to make an assertive message, you need to have you need to describe the person's behavior. Remember, this sounds a lot like perception checking. You need to describe how you feel. And third, describe the consequences of the other person's behavior for you. So that's kind of nice, I get embarrassed feelings when I hear you talk about my poor grades in front of our friends. That's the behavior. I'm afraid they'll think I'm stupid. That's the possible consequences. 3 seems to be the magic number. Again, I can't stress enough how important describing the behavior is. To you, the person observing this, it is very obvious. To the person who has exhibited these behaviors, it's not always so obvious. Okay. The third component, the third word that you can use to take responsibility, well, I mean, you doesn't obviously doesn't take responsibility, is we. And we use we to imply that the issue is something that concerns both the speaker and the receiver of the message. And it builds what they call verbal immediacy. But immediacy, we don't mean like immediately. That's not it's a connection. Okay. In fact, there's a great table on page 168 in the book that looks at the pros and cons and recommendations of I language, you language, and we language. Okay, obviously it's good to have a balance of all 3. We can get, if you use it too much, try to imagine, it's easy to imagine someone responding to the statement, we have a problem, by saying, maybe you have a problem, but don't tell me I do. So what you want to do is to try to mix these up. So let's say my husband and I had an agreement that if he ever won the lottery, we would each get a certain, we would divide it into thirds. He would get a third, I would get a third, and we'd spend a third on the house. Like, this is never going to happen, but we have this all planned out. And he comes home and he says, hey, I won. I have no idea. I'm bad with numbers. I won $100,000 in the lottery, and I went out and I spent half of it on a boat. Well, obviously, probably the flames are shooting out of my ears and eyeballs. And, if I say, you inconsiderate jerk, okay, not helpful. So what I would do is try to create a more assertive message and say, hon, do you remember that we talked about this and decided how we would do this? And now I am upset because you didn't follow our plan. So it's very clear how I feel about this, but it hasn't been all you did this, you did this, you did this, and you are a terrible person. It's a little more balanced. All right, so that's using I statements, we statements, and you statements. The last section under the language of responsibility, it's very interesting. It's also, I think, maybe the most challenging to understand, to actually put into place. The language of choice. In our speaking and in our thinking, we use a lot of have to and should and can't. And those words are very limiting to us. So the idea is that we can change our language to, instead of saying have to, I have to do this, I have to write this stupid paper. Okay? You change it to I'm going to. And you wouldn't say stupid. I'm going to write this paper. Okay? You might not be able to get as far as I want to write this, but that's a possibility. And instead of saying should, right? I should limit myself to 1 cup of coffee a day. Well, now I start to feel, so instead I say I will limit myself to 1 cup of water. That's 1 cup of coffee a day. I'm looking at my water bottle right now. Should implies an obligation, and will implies it's more of it's coming from inside me. And instead of can't, what about don't? I can't eat unhealthy snacks. Well, of course you can. Was somebody telling you this? Instead of saying, oh, I don't eat unhealthy snacks. What we're doing in this case is we're describing choices that we have made rather than obligations. And it's helpful if we focus on decisions like I will or I'm going to, rather than, I like that, begrudging acquiescence. I have no choice. I have to do this. So there's a concept called invitational communication, where we are letting people know that we have made certain choices and we're extending this choice to other people. So here's this. Instead of saying, you should, like you're saying to someone else, instead of I should, you say, you really should do your work on time. You could say something like, I'm going to work on the essay now, and you can join me if you want to. Or, let's see, again, have to becomes, you could say you're welcome to if you use that language, and we can't becomes I don't want to. All right. Then the idea is if you let someone know this is what I am going to do, you want to let the person know that they also have the freedom to make a choice, but it is not an obligation, because you don't want it to be a begrudging acquiescence. Yes. Okay. So you say, I am going to work on my paper now. I'd like you to work on it with me, but you're free to say no, as long as you mean it, as long as you're not trying to manipulate that person. Okay. So do you remember what the words are that we can use to better reflect responsibility in general? And now can you personalize it to yourself? What language can you use to take more responsibility for your thoughts and actions? I really want you to think about this and decide, are some of the what you learned in this section, can you see yourself applying it? Are others a little bit harder to use? And if so, why? And remember, when you're first doing something, if it's different from what you're used to, it's going to be awkward. You have to make it a habit. You've got to build up some, I can't even, my mind just went blank. Some familiarity with what you're doing, so it starts to feel a little bit more natural. All right, so that was section 3. In a little bit, we're going to do section 4.